Perplexities in Puerto Rico and Cuba. From the outset, the status of Puerto Rico was anomalous, neither a state nor a territory, and with little prospect of eventual independence. The Foraker Act of 1900 accorded the Puerto Ricans a limited degree of popular government and outlawed cockfighting, a favorite island pastime. Congress granted U.S. citizenship to Puerto Ricans in 1917, but withheld full self-rule. Although the American regime worked wondrous improvements in education, sanitation, and transportation, many of the inhabitants still aspired to independence. Great numbers of Puerto Ricans ultimately moved to New York City, where they added to the complexity of the melting pot. The annexation of Puerto Rico and the Philippines posed a thorny legal problem. Did the Constitution follow the flag? Did American laws, including tariff bills and the Bill of Rights, apply with full force to the newly acquired possessions? Who are we? A group of Puerto Rican petitioners asked Congress in 1900s. Are we citizens or are we subjects? Beginning in 1901, with the Insular Case, a badly divided Supreme Court decreed, in effect, the flag did outrun the Constitution, and that the outdistanced document would not necessarily extend with full force to the new windfall. Puerto Ricans and Filipinos might be subject to American rule, but they did not enjoy all American rights. Cuba, scorched and chaotic, presented another headache. An American military government set up under the administrative genius of General Leonard Wood, of Rough Rider fame, wrought miracles in government, finance, education, agriculture, and public health. Under his leadership and that of Colonel William C. Gorges, a frontal attack was launched on yellow fever. Spectacular experiments were performed by Dr. Walter Reed and others upon American soldiers who volunteered as human guinea pigs, and the Stegomyia mosquito was proved to be the lethal carrier. Cleaning up breeding places for mosquitoes wiped out yellow fever in Havana while dampening the fear of recurrent epidemics in cities of South and the Atlantic seaboard. The United States, honoring its self-denying Teller Amendments 1898, withdrew from Cuba in 1902. Old world imperialists could scarcely believe their eyes. But the Washington government could not turn this rich and strategic island completely loose on the international sea. A grasping power like Germany might secure dangerous lodgment near America's soft underbelly. The Cubans were therefore forced to write into their own Constitution of 1901 the so-called Platt Amendment. The Cubans loathed the amendment, which served McKinley's ultimate purpose of bringing Cuba under American control. Plattism survives as a colloquial term of derision even in modern-day Cuba. The newly liberated Cubans were forced to agree not to conclude treaties that might compromise their independence, as Uncle Sam saw it, and not to take on debt beyond their resources, as Uncle Sam measured them. They further agreed that the United States might intervene with troops to restore order when they saw it fit. Finally, the Cubans promised to sell or lease needed coal or naval stations, ultimately 2 and then only 1, Guantanamo, to their powerful benefactor. The United States finally abrogated the amendment in 1934, although Uncle Sam still occupies a 28,000-acre Cuban beachhead at Guantanamo under an agreement that can only be revoked by the consent of both parties. New Horizons in Two Hemispheres. In essence, the Spanish-American War was a kind of colossal coming-out party. Dewey's thundering guns merely advertised the fact that the nation was already a world power. The war itself was short, 113 days, low in casualties, and theatrically successful, despite the bungling. Secretary of State John Hay called it a splendid little war. American prestige rose sharply, and the Europeans grudgingly accorded the Republic more respect. Britain, France, Russia, and other great powers pointedly upgraded their legations in Washington, D.C., which had previously been regarded as a diplomatic backwater. An exhilarating new martial spirit thrills America, buoyed by the newly popular military marching band of John Philip Sousa. Most Americans did not start the war with consciously imperialistic motives, but after falling through the cellar door of imperialism in a drunken fit of idealism, they wound up with imperialistic and colonial fruits in their grasp. Colonel Mahan's big navyism seemed vindicated, energizing popular support for more and better battleships. A masterly organizer, Secretary of War Elihu Root established a general staff for the Army and founded the War College in Washington. One of the most beneficial results of the conflict was the further closing of the bloody chasm between the North and the South. Thousands of patriotic Southerners had flocked to the Stars and Stripes, and the gray-bearded General Joseph Wheeler, a Confederate cavalry hero of about 1,000 Civil War skirmishes and battles, was given a command in Cuba. He allegedly cried in the heat of battle, "To hell with the Yankees! Damn it, I mean the Spaniards!" Even so, the newly imperial nation was not yet prepared to pay the full bill of its new status. By taking on the Philippine Islands, the United States became a full-fledged Far Eastern power. But the distant islands eventually became a heel of Achilles, a kind of indefensible hostage given to Japan, as events proved in World War II. Here and elsewhere, the Americans had short-sightedly assumed burdensome commitments that they proved unwilling to defend with appropriate naval and military outlays. Little brown brothers in the Philippines. The liberty-loving Filipinos assumed that they, like the Cubans, would be granted their freedom after the Spanish-American War. They were tragically deceived. Washington excluded them from the peace negotiations with Spain and made clear its intention to stay in the Philippines indefinitely. Bitterness toward the occupying American troops erupted in open insurrection on February 4, 1899, under Emilio Aguinaldo. Having plunged into war with Spain to free Cuba, the United States was now forced to deploy some 126,000 troops 10 miles away to rivet shackles onto a people who asked for nothing but freedom, in the American tradition. The poorly equipped Filipino rebels soon melted into the jungle to wage vicious guerrilla warfare. Months earlier, American soldiers thought they were rescuing innocent victims of Spanish tyranny. Now, they viewed the Filipinos as dangerous enemies of the United States. This shift contributed to a mounting race war in which both sides perpetuated sordid atrocities. Uncle Sam's soldiers adopted the water cure, forcing water down victims' throats until they yielded informations or died. American-built reconcentration camps rivaled those of Butcher Whaler in Cuba. Having begun the Spanish War with noble ideals, America now dirtied its hands. One New York newspaper published a reply to Rupert Killing's famous poem. "We've taken up the white man's burden of ebony and brown. Now will you tell us, Rudyard, how we may put it down?" The Americans broke the back of the Filipino insurrection in 1901, where they cleverly infiltrated a guerrilla camp and captured Aguinaldo. But sporadic fighting dragged on for many dreary months, eventually claiming the lives of 4,234 Americans and as many as 600,000 Filipinos. Future President William H. Taft, an able and amiable Ohioan who weighed some 350 pounds, became a civil governor of the Philippines in 1901. Forming a strong attachment to the Philippines, he called them his little brown brothers, and danced light-footedly with Filipino women. But McKinley's benevolent assimilation of the Philippines proceeded with painful slowness. Washington poured millions of dollars into the island to improve roads, sanitation, and public health. Important economic ties, including trade and sugar, developed between the two peoples. American teachers set up an unusually good school system and helped make English a second language. But all this vast expenditure, which profited America little, was ill received. The Filipinos hated compulsory Americanization and pined for liberty. They finally got their freedom on the 4th of July, 1946, and in the meantime, thousands of Filipinos immigrated to the United States. Hinting the door open in China. Ominous events had meanwhile been brewing in faraway and enfeebled China. After its defeat by Japan in 1894 to 1895, the imperialistic European powers, notably Germany and Russia, moved in. Like vultures descending upon a wounded animal, they began to tear away valuable leaseholds and economic spheres of influence from the Manchu government. The growing group of Americans viewed the vivisection of China with alarm. Churches worried about their missionary strongholds, merchants feared that Europeans would monopolize Chinese markets. An alarmed American public, openly prodded by the press and slyly nudged by certain free trade Britons, demanded that Washington do something. Secretary of State John Hay, a quiet but witty poet, novelist, and diplomat, with a flair for capturing the popular imagination, finally decided upon a dramatic move. In summer of 1899, Hay dispatched to all the great powers a communication soon known as the Open Door Note. He urged them to announce that in their leaseholds or spheres of influence, they would respect certain Chinese rights and the ideal of fair competition. Tellingly, Hay had not bothered to consult the Chinese themselves. The phrase "open door" quickly caught the American public fantasy, but Hay's proposal caused much squirming in the leading capitals of the world, though all the great powers save Russia, with covetous design in Manchuria, eventually agreed to it. Open door or not, patriotic Chinese did not care to be used as a doormat by the Western powers. In 1900, a super patriotic group known as the Boxers, for their training in the martial arts, broke loose with the cry, "Kill foreign devils." In what became known as the Boxer Rebellion, they murdered more than 200 foreigners and thousands of Chinese Christians and besieged the foreign diplomatic community in the capital, Beijing, also known as Peking. A multinational rescue force of some 18,000 soldiers arrived in the nick of time and quelled the rebellion. They included several thousand American troops dispatched from the Philippines to protect U.S. rights under the 1844 Treaty of Wanghia and to keep the open door prodded open. The victorious Allied invaders acted angrily and vindictively. They assessed prostrate China an excessive indemnity of $333 million, of which America's share was to be 24.5 million. When Washington discovered that this sum was much more than enough to pay the damages and expenses, it remitted about $18 million to be used for the education of a select group of Chinese students in the United States, a not-so-subtle initiative to further the westernization of Asia. Secretary Hay let fly another paper broadside in 1900. Secretary Hay let another paper fly broadside. Secretary Hay let fly another paper broadside in 1900, announcing that henceforth the open door would embrace the traditional integrity of China. Secretary Hay let fly another paper broadside in 1900, announcing that henceforth the open door would embrace the territorial integrity of China, in addition to its commercial integrity. Those principles helped spare China from possible partition in those troubled years and were formally incorporated into the Nine-Power Treaty of 1922, only to be callously violated by Japan's takeover of Manchuria a decade later. Law. Imperialism or Bryanism in the 1900s. President McKinley's renomination by the Republicans in 1900 was a foregone conclusion. He had won a war and acquired rich, though burdensome, real estate. He had safeguarded the gold standard, and he had brought the promised prosperity of the full dinner pail. An irresistible vice presidential boom developed for Theodore Teddy Roosevelt, TR, the cowboy hero of the Cuban campaign. Capitalizing on his war-born popularity, he had been elected governor of New York, where the local political bosses had found him headstrong and difficult to manage. They therefore devised a scheme to kick the colorful colonel upstairs to the vice presidency. This plot to railroad Roosevelt worked beautifully. Gesticulating wildly, he sported a Western-style cowboy hat that made him stand out like the White Crow at a Republican convention. To cries of, "We want Teddy," he was handily nominated. A wary Mark Hanna reportedly moaned that there would now be only one heartbeat between the damned cowboy and the presidency of the United States. William Jennings Bryan was the odds-on choice of the Democrats, meeting the Kansas City. William Jennings Bryan was the odds-on choice of the Democrats, meeting at Kansas City. Their platform proclaimed that the paramount issue was Republican overseas imperialism. McKinley, the source of dignity, once again campaigned safely from his front porch. Bryan again took charge and abolished. McKinley, the soul of dignity, once again campaigned safely from his front porch. Bryan again took to the stump in a cyclonic campaign. Lincoln, he charged, had abolished slavery for 3.5 million Africans. McKinley had reestablished it for 7 million Filipinos. Roosevelt out-Bryaned Bryan, touring the country with revolver-shooting cowboys. Flashing his monumental teeth and pounding his fist into his palm, Roosevelt denounced all dastards who would haul down Old Glory. McKinley handily triumphed by much wider margins. McKinley handily triumphed by a much wider margin than in 1896. 7,218,491 to 6,356,000. 7,218,491 to 6,356,734 popular votes and 292 to 155 electoral votes. But victory for the Republicans was not a mandate for or against imperialism. If there was any mandate at all, it was for the two P's. prosperity, and protectionism. Meanwhile, the New York bosses gleefully looked forward to watching the nettlesome Roosevelt take the veil as vice president. T.R., brandisher of the big stick. Kindly, William McKinley had scarcely served another 6 months when in September 1901 he was murdered by a deranged anarchist in Buffalo, New York. Roosevelt rode a buckboard out of his campsite in the Adirondacks to take the oath of office, becoming, at age 42, the youngest president thus far in American history. Born into a wealthy and distinguished New York family, Roosevelt, a red-blooded blue blood, had fiercely brought up his spindly, asthmatic body by a stern and self-imposed regime of exercise. Law! Roosevelt, a red-blooded blue blood, had fiercely built up his spindly, asthmatic body by a stern and self-imposed routine of exercise. Educated partly in Europe, he graduated from Harvard with 5 Beta Kappa honors and published, at the age of 24, the first of some 30 volumes of muscular prose. He worked as a ranch owner and cowboy in the Dakotas before pursuing his political career full-time. Barrel-chested, bespectacled, and 5 feet 10 inches tall, with mule-like mores, squinty eyes, droopy mustache, and piercing voice, he was ever the delight of cartoonists. The Rough Rider's high-voltage energy was electrifying. Believing that it was better to wear out than to rust out, he would shake the hands of some 6,000 people at one stretch or ride horseback many miles a day as an example for portly cavalry officers. Incurably boyish and bellicose, Roosevelt ceaselessly preached the virile virtues and denounced pacifistic flub-dubs and mollycoddles, an ardent champion of military and naval preparedness. He adopted his pet proverb, speak softly and carry a big stick, and you will go far. His outsized ego caused it to be said of him that he wanted to be a bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. He loved people and mingled with those of all ranks, from Catholic cardinals to professional prize fighters, one of whom blinded a Rooseveltian eye in a White House bout. T.R. commanded an idolatrous personal following. After visiting him, a journalist wrote, "You go home and wring the personality out of all your clothes." Above all, T.R. believed that the president should lead boldly. He had no real respect for the delicate checks and balances among the 3 branches of government. The president, he felt, may take any action in the general interest that is not specifically forbidden by the laws of the Constitution. More is left. Oh my God. Building the Panama Canal. Roosevelt soon applied his bullish energy to foreign affairs. The Spanish-American War had reinvigorated interest in the long-talked-about canal across the Central American Isthmus, through only which a printer's ink has ever flowed. Americans had learned a sobering lesson when the battleship Oregon, stationed on the Pacific coast at the outbreak of the war in 1898, took weeks of steam all the way around South America to join U.S. fleets in Cuban waters. An Isthmian canal would plainly augment the strength of the Navy by increasing its mobility. Such a waterway would also make easier the defense of such recent acquisitions as Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippines, while facilitating the operations of the U.S. merchant machine. Such a waterway would make easier the defense of such recent acquisitions as Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippines, while facilitating the operations of the U.S. merchant marine. Initial obstacles in the path of the canal builders were legal rather than geographical. In the terms of the ancient Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, concluded with Britain in 1850, the United States could not secure exclusive control over an Isthmian route. But by 1901, America's British cousins were willing to yield ground. Confronted with an unfriendly Europe and bogged down in the South African Boer War, they consented to the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty in 1901. They not only gave the United States a free hand to build the canal, but concluded the right to fortify it as well. But where exactly should the canal be dug? Many American experts favored a route across Nicaragua, but agents of the old French Canal Company were eager to salvage something from their costly failure at the S-shaped Panama. Represented by a young, energetic, and unscrupulous engineer, Philippe Wow Varilla, Philippe Benau Varia, the new Panama Canal Company suddenly dropped the price of its holding from $109 million to the fire sale price of $40 million. Congress in June 1902 finally decided on the Panama route. The scene now shifted to Colombia, of which Panama was a The scene now shifted to Colombia, of which Panama was now a restive part. The Colombian Senate rejected an American offer of $10 million and an annual payment of $250,000 for a 6-mile wide zone across Panama. Roosevelt railed against those Dagos. Roosevelt railed against those Dagos. Roosevelt railed against those Dagos who were frustrating his ambitions. Meanwhile, impatient Panamanians who had rebelled numerous times were ripe for another revolt. They had counted on a wave of prosperity to follow construction of the canal, and they feared the United States would now turn to the Nicaraguan route. Scheming Benau Faria was no less disturbed by the prospect of losing the company's $40 million. Working hands in glove with the revolutionists, he helped incite a rebellion on November 3, 1903. U.S. naval forces prevented Colombian troops from crossing the isthmus to quell the uprising. Roosevelt moved rapidly to make Simi Panama a virtual outpost of the United States. Just 3 days after the insurrection, he hastily extended the right hand of recognition. 15 days later, Benalveria, who was now the Panamanian minister despite his French citizenship, signed the Hayes-Benalveria Treaty in Washington. The price for the canal strip was left the same, but the zone was widened from 6 to 10 miles. The French company gladly pocketed its $10 million from the U.S. Treasury. Roosevelt, it seemed clear, did not actively plot to tear Panama from the side of Colombia, but the conspirators knew of his angrily expressed views, and they counted on using his big stick to hold Colombia at bay. The Rough Rider became so indiscreetly involved in the Panama affair as to create the impression that he had been a secret party to the intrigue, and so called the Rape of Panama marched down The Rough Rider became so indiscreetly involved with the Panama affair as to create the impression that he had been the secret party in the intrigue, and the so-called Rape of Panama marked an ugly downward lurch in the U.S. relations with Latin America. Canal construction began in 1904, in the face of daunting difficulties ranging from labor troubles to landslides and lethal tropical diseases. Colonel William C. Gorges, the quiet, determined exterminator of yellow fever in Havana, ultimately made the canal zone as safe as a health resort. At the cost of some $400 million, an autocratic West Point engineer, Colonel George Washington Goethals, ultimately brought the project to completion in 1914, just as World War I was breaking out. TR's perversion of Monroe's doctrine. Latin American debt defaults prompted further Rooseveltian involvement in affairs south of the border. Nations such as Venezuela and the Dominican Republic were chronically in arrears in their payments to European creditors. Germany actually bombarded a town in delinquent Venezuela in 1903. Roosevelt feared that if the Germans or British got their foot in the door as bill collectors, they might remain in Latin America, in flagrant violation of the Monroe Doctrine. He therefore declared a brazen policy of protective intervention, better known as the Roosevelt He therefore declared a brazen policy of preventative intervention, better known as the Roosevelt Corollary, better known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. He announced that in the event of future financial malfeasance, He announced that in the event of future financial malfeasance by Latin American nations, the United States itself would intervene, take over the customs houses, pay off the debt, and keep the troublesome Europeans at the other side of the Atlantic. In short, no outsiders could push around the Latin nations except Uncle Sam, policeman of the Caribbean. This new brandishing of the big stick in the Caribbean would become effective in 1905 when the United States took over the management of tariff collections in the Dominican Republic, an arrangement formalized in a treaty with the Dominicans 2 years later. TR's rewriting of the Monroe Doctrine probably did more than any other single step to promote the bad neighbor policy begun in these years. As time wore on, the new corollary was used to justify wholesale interventions and repeated landings of the Marines, all of which helped to return As time wore on, the new corollary was used to justify wholesale interventions and repeated landing of the Marines, all of which helped turn the Caribbean into a Yankee lake. To Latin Americans, it seemed as though the revised Monroe Doctrine, far from providing a shield, was a cloak behind which the United States sought to strangle them. The shadow of the big stick likewise fell again on Cuba in 1906. Revolutionary disorders brought an appeal from the Cuban president, and The shadow of the big stick likewise fell again on Cuba in 1906. Revolutionary disorders brought an appeal from the Cuban president, and necessity being the mother of all intervention, U.S. Marines landed. These police forces were withdrawn temporarily in 1909, but in Latin American eyes, the episode was but another example of a creeping power of the Colossus of the North. Roosevelt on the world stage. Booted and spurred, Roosevelt charged into international affairs far beyond Latin America. The outbreak of war between Russia and Japan in 1904 gave him a chance to perform as a global statesman. The Russian bear, having lumbered across Asia, was seeking to bathe its frostbitten paws into the ice-free ports of China's Manchuria, especially Port Arthur. In Japan's eyes, Manchuria and Korea in Tsarist hands were pistols pointed at Japan's strategic heart. Japan responded in 1904 with a devastating surprise pounce on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. The Japanese responded in 1904 with a devastating surprise pounce on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. They proceeded to administer a humiliating series of beatings to the inept Russians, the first serious military setback to a European major power by a non-European force since the Turkish invasions of the 16th century. But as the war dragged on, Japan began to run short of men and yen, a weakness it did not want to betray to its enemy. Tokyo officials therefore approached Roosevelt in the deepest secrecy and asked him to help sponsor peace negotiations. Roosevelt was happy to oblige, as he wanted to avoid a complete Russian collapse so that the Tsarist Empire could remain a counterweight to Japan's growing power. At Portsmouth, New Hampshire in 1905, TR guided the warring parties to a settlement that satisfied neither side and left the At Portsmouth, New Hampshire in 1905, TR guided the warring parties to a settlement that satisfied neither side and left the Japanese, who felt that they had won the war, especially resentful. Japan was forced to drop its demands for a cash indemnity and Russian evacuation of the Sakhalin Islands, though it received some compensation in the form of effective control over Korea, which it formally annexed in 1910. For achieving this agreement, as well as for helping arrange an international conference at Algeciras, Spain, in 1906 to mediate North African disputes, TR received a Nobel Peace Prize in 1906. But the price of its diplomatic glory was high for U.S. foreign relations. Two historic friendships withered on the windswept plains of Manchuria. U.S. relations with Russia, once friendly, soured as the Russians implausibly accused Roosevelt of robbing them of military victory. Revelations about savage massacres of Russian Jews further poisoned American feelings about Russia. Japan, once America's protege, felt cheated out of its due compensation. Both newly powerful, Japan and America became rivals in Asia, as fear and jealousy between them grew. A subject race is only funny when it's rarely subject, said Finley Peter Dunlees. A subject race is only funny when it's rarely subject. I'm not doing that. Said Finley. A subject race is only funny when it's rarely subject, said Finley Peter Dunn's Mr. Dooley. About 3 years ago, I stopped laughing at Japanese jokes. Japanese laborers in California. America's Pacific coast soon felt the effects of the Russo-Japanese War. A new relentlessness swept over the rice paddies. Japanese laborers in California. America's Pacific coast soon felt the effects of the Russo-Japanese War. America's Pacific coast soon felt the effects of the Russo-Japanese War. A new relentlessness swept over the rice paddies of Japan, occasioned by the recent conflict dislocations and tax burdens. A new wave of Japanese immigrants began pouring into the spacious valleys of California. Although Japanese residents never amounted to more than 3% of the state's population, white Californians ranted about the new yellow peril and feared being drowned out in an Asian sea. A showdown on the influx came in 1906 when San Francisco School Board, coping with the aftermath of a frightful earthquake and fire, ordered the segregation of Chinese, Japanese, and Korean students in a special school to free more space for whites. Instantly, the incident boiled down to an international crisis. The people of Japan, understandably sensitive on questions of race, regarded this discrimination as an insult both to them and their beloved children. On both sides of the Pacific, irresponsible war talk sizzled in the yellow press. The real yellow peril. Roosevelt, who as a Rough Rider had relinquished shooting, was less happy over the prospect that California might stir up a war that all the other states would have to wage. He therefore invited the entire San Francisco Board of Education, headed by a bassoon-playing mayor under the indictment for graft, to come to the White House. TR finally broke the deadlock, but not until he had brandished his big stick and bared his big teeth. The Californians were induced to repeal the offensive school order and to accept what came to be known as the Gentleman's Agreement. By the secret understanding worked out during 1907 to 1908, Tokyo agreed to stop the flow of laborers to the American mainland by withholding passports. Worried that his intercession might be interpreted in Tokyo as prompted by fear, Roosevelt hit upon a dramatic scheme to impress the Japanese with the heft of his big stick. He daringly decided to send his entire battleship fleet on a highly visible voyage around the world. Late in 1907, 16 sparkling white, smoke-belching battleships started from Virginia waters. Their commander pointedly declared that he was ready for a feast, a frolic, or a fight. The Great White Fleet, saluted by cannonading champagne corks. The Great White Fleet, saluted by cannonading champagne corks, received tumultuous welcomes in Latin America, Hawaii, New Zealand, and Australia, although it ended up having to borrow coal from the British to complete its voyage. As events turned out, an overwhelming reception in Japan was the high point of the trip. Tens of thousands of kimonoed school children trained to wave tiny American flags, movingly sang the Star-Spangled Banner. In the warm diplomatic atmosphere, in the warm diplomatic atmosphere created by the visit, in the warm diplomatic atmosphere In the warm diplomatic atmosphere created by the visit of the fleet, the U.S. signed the Root-Takahira Agreement with Japan in 1908. It pledged both powers to respect each other's territorial possessions in the Pacific and to uphold it pledged to it pledged both powers to respect each other's territorial possessions in the Pacific and to uphold the open door in China. For the moment, at least, the two rising rival powers had found a means to maintain the peace.